Welcome to this BW Dialogue on Leadership on the BW Global World. It's a global world. I hope it stays a global world. Today we have a global citizen and a global leader and somebody who understands trade, economy, business, and how companies and promoters and CEOs look at building businesses, where to build the business, where is the flow of the business. We have a very special guest in Dr. Mukesh Aghi, who's the President and CEO of the US-India Strategic Partnership Forum. Welcome, Dr. Aghi. It's a very good morning from where you're joining us. Thank you for joining us, and our viewers are eagerly looking forward to hearing your perspective on how post-COVID the Indo-US relationship will become better, hopefully, how more American companies will invest in India, and really the India dream of getting American companies that want to relocate out of China will be a real dream and not a pipe dream. How have been the last 60 days for you, and what's been keeping you busy?
Yeah, I think US had its own lockdown, its own challenges on the COVID-19. I think when you look at US is coming out very well. What we say here is while China got the world into trouble on COVID, it's US which is going to get the world out of COVID issues. And one thing which I've noticed is that last 90 days, as you asked the question, I've never seen the innovative juices of American entrepreneur coming up with almost 100 vaccines being tried, innovative ideas. So I think as far as we are concerned, while there's a lockdown, the resiliency of America has woken up.
Fantastic. That's a very optimistic note to start in, that in spite of all the negative news that we see, the loss of life, the loss of livelihood, the American entrepreneurs have been at the forefront of finding solutions for the epidemic and hopefully building enterprises that will make an impact in the next few years. Dr. Aghi, you talk to American CEOs, you talk to American entrepreneurs, you talk to Indian CEOs, you talk to Indian entrepreneurs. What is the overwhelming sentiment in American CEOs and entrepreneurs' mind when it comes to their operations in China? Do you think at some stage India can reap the dividend of some of the American companies, if at all they leave China, coming to India? I want to ask you a direct question, and I'd welcome a direct response.
So my response is as follows. In my discussion with the boardrooms, is that one thing which has happened is that the current dependency on China on critical supply chain is being questioned, both by the business community and both by the administration here. And that means they're relooking at the whole supply chain. That's one. Second aspect is US companies are not going to leave China overnight. And the reason is China is a large market, growing market, and they want share of that market. But the boardrooms are also saying, what is your China plus one strategy? In essence, you don't have to manufacture everything in China for the rest of the world. You manufacture in China for China only and find alternative sites to manufacture. That means either bringing it back to the US or looking at alternative countries and geographies. Come into play from that perspective.
So you said three important things. One is that the administration and the entrepreneurs are questioning over dependence on China in terms of the supply chain. Second, you said that they are looking at China as a huge market, and hopefully when they're in China, they produce for the Chinese market. And the third, you're saying possibly some of the benefits will be reaped by India and Indian companies, right?
That's correct.
That's the correct. 3 points you're making.
Correct.
Now, I would like to ask you that what are the sectors you see post-COVID Indo-American collaboration going up, both at a federal level as well as the entrepreneur to entrepreneur, both at the G2G and what I call E2E level. Give us your insights in which sectors are primed up to further collaboration, investments, and footprints growing.
So I think you have to understand from a broader perspective, role of India in Indo-Pacific region and role of India's economy in the region itself. Number one, US, India are geopolitically aligned. In fact, US has been putting India on the pedestal on the Indo-Pacific region to play a much more proactive role. And if you last 24 months, there have been more joint exercises between India and the US than any other countries in the world itself. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is Quad, which is Japan, India, US, and Australia. They've been meeting on every aspect from supply chain to maritime exercises to looking at cybersecurity and other aspects. So that process has picked up. What we are seeing is while the China stress factor gets deeper and bigger, US companies are saying India provides an opportunity for us for multiple reasons. One is you look at Amazon, you look at Google, you look at WhatsApp, you look at Uber. They dominate the Indian economic environment and they are completely shut out of China. So India has been very, very open to US companies to come in and provide their value proposition. I think the challenge we see, and to answer your question, is the opportunity first we see is very much into the defense sector. You have to understand the strength of India is services economy, is 60% of its export is services economy, and that's mainly in software and services. And as defense moves, what we are seeing is two factors. One is that defense is becoming more and more software rather than just hardware. That's one aspect. And so we will see more and more effort coming in between US entrepreneurs and Indian entrepreneurs focusing on the defense ecosystem and providing technologies in that area itself. That's one. Second, the strength of India's manufacturing is on the generic pharma healthcare side. And I think India's government leadership played a very pivotal role by not stopping everything just for India, but being more of a statesman. The Prime Minister Modi played that role and providing some of these supplies to over 80 plus countries around the world. That showed that India leadership was looking at trying to provide the solution on a global basis. So what we see is more and more collaboration taking place in the healthcare and pharma aspect. You have to understand when you have 1.3 billion people in India and GDP spending on healthcare in India is below 2%, healthcare is going to be a pivotal play both for the US companies and Indian companies. So we see more and more collaboration taking place. The final thing is on the digital economy side. We feel that India, US, when you look at the startup scene in the Silicon Valley, you know, almost 3 out of 4 startups has some kind of an Indian touch point. And what we see is that collaboration is going to take more and more. In fact, we have a platform where we are able to bring in Indian startups at a certain stage to launch themselves into the US environment. We provide them funding, we provide them access to large companies itself. So that platform seems to be moving very, very well. So we will see more and more Indian companies in startup phase coming with product environment, not services, product environment coming to the US market. So we see the potential of collaboration and trade between the two countries going up more and more in a positive direction.
Fantastic. You mentioned 5 sectors. One, you mentioned about the defense sector. You mentioned about the healthcare sector. You talked about manufacturing. You talked about, what the e-commerce majors are doing. And you talked about how digital economy overall will get a fillip. And that possibly touches every sector. And you talked about how companies in Silicon Valley have an Indian connection. You use the word Indian touch point. I would use the word Indian connection. Now, I would have asked you about the reforms. Apart from bringing in liquidity, the government has looked at this opportunity to bring in reforms. You look at the mining sector. The government has opened up the mining sector. Defense, you alluded to, the government has increased the FDI limit. And American defense companies have been working in India for a long time. They have been partners to Indian companies in the defense sector. So tell us, how do American companies view the specific development in the defense sector? Because defense sector is a very big sector. The impact it has on the economy in terms of numbers is huge.
So I think you have to understand, let me first answer the question of reform, and then I'll come to the defense sector. I think the government of India has made a lot of progress on bringing changes to the local environment. But I think when you benchmark on a global basis, countries like Singapore, Hong Kong, or Vietnam, we are way, way behind. That's one factor. Second factor
in spite of us improving on the ease of doing business.
Absolutely.
In spite, we have a long way to go, you say.
It is, because you have to understand the World Bank ranking of ease of doing business only takes two cities in India, Mumbai and Delhi. Investments go beyond Mumbai and Delhi. And that's where the reform has to come in. But I think more important from the reform perspective, it is important to understand there has to be a predictability in policy making. There has to be a transparency in policy making. There has to be a consultative process. I mean, you cannot have a reform and then overnight you change the policy. In the case of Walmart coming in with a $16.5 billion investment, and then you change the policy in e-commerce. That sends a wrong message to the boardroom itself. Or what happened in Andhra Pradesh, change of government, suddenly they cancel all the contracts. All the investment which happened are struggling still itself. So I think there has to be a sense of predictability in the environment for companies to look at long-term investment into the country. So that's one aspect. But I have to say that recently, after the COVID, or during the COVID crisis, every state has stepped up and trying to make changes to the environment. But I think we need to have this as a long-term rather than a short-term reaction to the current COVID crisis. On the defense side, I have you to basically, I want you to envision almost 20 plus years ago, India generic industry was exporting mainly to Africa and other countries. Today, India's generic industry has roughly over 30% of the US market, and they bring almost $20 billion savings to the US government by the generic drugs itself. Now you apply the same thing on the defense side. Defense is becoming more and more of a software. That's where the strength of India is. 20 years going forward, can India be the defense manufacturer and supply just as the pharma generic market itself? The answer is yes. And I think that's where we have to start looking at where do you want to focus on, what kind of partnership you want to bring in, and make sure you start bringing those manufacturing. Today, India, makes the cabin for Swarovski helicopters in Hyderabad. That's a helicopter used by President of the US. The wings of Airbus are made in India. So there's a lot of stuff which is happening. Now we need to consolidate, focus, and start moving in the right direction.
Fantastic. Dr. Aghi says to the government and to the policymakers, be consistent in your policy. Certainty as far as investments is very important. There has to be consistency, and ideally there should be no policy changes from retrospect, whether in the tax regime or in terms of the operating guidelines. That's what Dr. Aghi is saying. If we just do that, we'll get more American companies coming to India. And the dream of getting more American companies to create investment and jobs in India will happen. We also talk about how defense sector will actually see investment, and it said that defense sector is becoming more like software. It will be hardware and software, the role of technology, and hence the role of Indian enterprises and Indian talent will grow there. He also talked about the pharmaceutical sector, how generics as an area saved the American government monies. And if we continue to accelerate in that direction, that could be an area of opportunity. Dr. Aghi, I want to ask my last question and bring our managing editor online, Mr. Abhinav Trivedi, into this conversation. My last question would be, you referred that the ease of doing business only takes Delhi and Bombay, and the American companies have operations beyond Delhi, Bombay, especially the tier 2, tier 3 cities are booming, right? From a manufacturing standpoint, some of those cities are very relevant. Now, I want to ask you this question. You also talked about Vietnam. Textile and garments has moved to Vietnam. The BPO, KPO industry is moving to Vietnam, right? I'm just taking from where. Now, what has Vietnam done that we in India can learn? What is it that Vietnam is getting right and we are not getting right?
I think you look at Vietnam, and we did a benchmark study between India and Vietnam from that perspective. And India did last year, you have to give credit to the government, brought the corporate tax down and brought it lower for the new manufacturing plant. It was the right move. But what we need to have is land reform. Manufacturing side needs land. It needs to have labor reform. Again, there has to be a level playing field for these companies to come in. There has to be a infrastructure supply chain management. We moved a company from China on the high-tech side into India. And from a policy perspective, every perspective, it was even. Where the challenge came in was the supply chain, the logistic of moving goods from one point to another geography, the delay in custom, the delay on the trucks itself raised the cost of that good by 20%. So I think it's important to understand it's not just pure tax policy. It's not just about labor and land reform. It's about the whole global supply chain. How easily goods can move between geography A and geography B, because goods are no longer manufactured in one area. And then how you basically create an ecosystem of suppliers. The advantage China has is it has most of its suppliers within a specific geography itself, a specific industry. We need to start creating that also. So this movement of sub-suppliers to the main suppliers also move very fast. So to come back to your question on Vietnam, I think it's important to understand that Vietnam, beside doing all the tax aspect, proactively created an environment for these companies to come in and move very, very fast in a very predictable, transparent, and open environment. I think that's where India needs to focus to attract Chinese companies coming into India itself.
Fantastic. Abhinav, you want to ask Dr. Aghi?
Sure, Dr. Aghi, good evening, firstly. I like the frame behind you. There are a lot of books. I mean, books have always been a subject of intrigue for me. My question, you did suggest a few sectors where India and US can collaborate. I would like to ask your opinion on the space technologies. Okay, now NASA and ISRO have been independently doing a lot of work in space technology, and there are a lot of startups emerging in the sector in both the countries. Do you see there any collaborative expertise coming together from both the countries as far as space technology and space exploration is concerned?
Well, India has done a fantastic job on the space technology, while it struggled on the aeroplane and jet fighter technology itself. It's ironic, India was able to do its mission to Mars at a much lower budget than the movie Gravity was made itself. So I think we see a lot of potential, especially on the commercial side, as US also gets more and more privatized, either through Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos' venture itself. I think India has to start looking at basically moving away from government-owned, controlled space environment, and how do you bring private sector and startups coming in this area. We see tremendous potential there. I think there's a lot of space for India and US to collaborate, both from a G2G perspective and also from a B2B perspective.
Can you elaborate that a little? Because when it comes to space exploration, NASA and ISRO are government organizations, but US, for example, has Tesla, which is exploring space tourism. India doesn't have that. So are there any changes required from the policy side as far as India is concerned? Or do you think there is more entrepreneurship needed as far as India is concerned in space technology?
I think both are needed. I'll give you an example. We brought in Hughes Network into India to be able to provide broadband through satellite itself. Because ISRO seems to be controlling that, they won't let them come in. You have to bring in competition to make government or entity more efficient and competitive from a commercial perspective. So I think you have to bring a sense of commercialization into that environment for it to become much more efficient and effective and bring cost of services to the citizen at much lower price.
Sure.
Go ahead. You go ahead.
Yeah, sure. This will be my last question, Dr. Mukesh. I would want to understand from you 6 months ago when this corona was not the talk of the town, US-China trade deficit, or maybe the trust deficit, that's the right word to use, was also amongst the highest. What were the wine conversations around entrepreneurs, investors, which you were having? What were the table conversations at that time as far as China-US equations are concerned? Because India being accommodated more and more in US foreign policy also means drifting away of China. So how are the investors and entrepreneurs coping up with this triology I mean, China going out, India coming in. What are the sentiment in the minds of American investors and entrepreneurs who would want to invest in India and would want to partner with India and not upset the political setup at the same time?
Well, I think you have to understand there was a political rhetoric, and then there's a real issues on the ground level.
Sure.
China, since 1972, has been basically supported by US businesses and US government to integrate itself into the global environment. And in the last, I would say, 5 years at least minimum, countries, companies, and citizens are realizing that you cannot change China and start thinking like the Western world. They have their own value system, they have their own processes itself. It is going to behave according to its own environment itself. So you cannot change China at all. And that has come out much strongly in the political rhetoric. Now, when you look at India, India is different in the sense is we're English speaking, we are democracy, we have same value system as compared to the US itself. You look at the Indian diaspora, 4 million plus in the US, completely integrated into society, up in the management structure, up in the government structure, up in the judiciary structure. They have progressed very well. In fact, if you look at Indian diaspora today, on a per capita basis, they have the highest income. They contribute the highest on a per capita basis to the philanthropy itself. And they have one of the lowest crime rate among any minority group in the US itself. So I think what has happened is there's a natural discussion going on as to how do we keep on leveraging India more as a market, more as a business partner, and more as a geopolitical partner itself. And I think those discussions are getting accelerated in every aspect. I think the challenge is more on the business side, where we are saying that in the boardroom, there's a certain amount of India fatigue also is setting in by saying, you know, we come in, policy gets changed. We come in, we don't get the same level playing field like any other local company itself. I think that has to happen because you have roughly over $2 trillion long-term capital in the US lying, looking for investment. And right. India is a potential destination, but we have to give assurance to this long-term capital that there has to be consistency, there has to be transparency and level playing field for the companies itself.
Which includes land and labor reforms, according to you?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Okay. Dr. Batra?
You know, there are questions coming. There's somebody who knows you for a while, so he calls you by a first name. I'm a little old-fashioned. I won't call you first name. I don't know you. So he says, "Hi Mukesh, this is your former colleague, IBM colleague, Narahari. Why do you think, in spite of so much of technical talent, India still lacks in technology innovation? Why is it patents registered by Indian engineers are far lesser than in the US or even China?"
Well, I think you have to understand when you look at from a technology perspective in the US, look in the labs. Most of the patents coming out from these labs are by Indian scientists, Indian engineers itself. When you come to India, we did an analysis of 2000 coming out of India. 50% of the patents coming out of India were by American companies in their own centers itself. So the challenge is we don't have an ecosystem where universities, industry, government, VCs are intertwined, interconnected, and have a commercialization process of those patents and technology. Unless you build that ecosystem, I think the patent process will not pick up. So I just want to say hello to Narahari, one of my first employees I hired when I was in IBM India. So you know the ingenuity of Indians, trying to leverage technology is tremendous. I think it's a lack of environment which slows them down.
It's like a collaboration amongst all stakeholders.
Absolutely.
And at a formal, at the university level, at the ideas level, you know, ideas are great, but maybe go-to-market doesn't happen. Maybe they don't get capital. So, you know, the incubators that exist on American universities possibly bring out the best in Indian students and talent that goes there. Right?
Absolutely.
So I think
Sure. Also,
Yes,
for the record, Dr. Mukesh highlighted ecosystem. For our viewers who are watching us, for the record, it still takes 64 months in India to file a patent, which is more than 5 years. We did a story on this on Business World a few days ago, and still takes 5 years. In US, it takes far less than 6 months. So that is
Yeah,
also
absolutely.
one of the reasons why most of the people go to US and file a patent from there.
Correct.
Dr. Aghi, I want to ask you two, three more forward-looking questions. You talked about historically what India can do better in terms of certainty of policy. Now, if you've looked at the stimulus and the reforms package, the government in the limited fiscal leeway it has tried to do its best. More is needed, and I'm sure the government uh, will do some sectoral interventions. But if you had to advise the government of India or give inputs, advise is a strong word, the government is very wise, they have all the, what would be your two, three specific inputs to the government of India to be able to capitalize on the opportunities that are coming out of COVID? Natural advantages that you talked India has, the head start it has in pharmaceuticals.
I think my advice to government of India is you have a perfect environment to take difficult reforms and change them now, because you have an environment where everybody believes in this leadership. And I have to compliment the leadership from the Prime Minister down, how efficiently, effectively they were able to bring the lockdown. And as you mentioned earlier in our conversation, India has the lowest mortality rate per million anywhere in the world itself. So I think that shows the forward thinking itself. But I think now, as you open the economy, it is important that India looks at changing some of the difficult reforms which needs to happen to invite more and more investment, because the Indian economy needs roughly around $100 billion investment on an annual basis to basically realize this vision of $5 trillion economy in the next 5-10 years itself. So I think those reforms are critical. We talk to the senior bureaucrats and they all would like to do it, but it has to percolate down to the lower level, to the tier 2, tier 3 cities, and to the district level itself.
Fantastic. I think we also have my editorial colleague, he's our youngest colleague, Kavi. Kavi, you'd like to ask Dr. Aghi a question?
Dr. Mukesh, is there any, when it comes to cultural exchange between India and US, education is one sector which has been explored and to a certain extent taken advantage of a lot in the past years. But of late, there has been more of a friction as far as India-US education exchange is concerned. What do you recommend for cultural exchange to grow between India and US, apart from watching more of Marvel and DC comics and India having more fans of Eminem than any other South Asian countries? Is there any other way where we can exchange more of cultural exchange between India and US, enhance the cultural exchange?
Oh, a lot. India has so much to offer, so much to offer. And it's not just Bollywood itself. I mean, it's a country with a culture which goes back 5,000 plus years. Somebody asked me to define India and the US. While US, you say, is a melting pot, India is a salad bowl where you have multiple cultures together thriving itself. You have to build a platform. Yes, you have Bollywood, which softens the image of India. But I think we have to go beyond Bollywood itself. And we lack that platform in the sense is how do we basically bring in some of the, let's take the artist itself from India, be it not just only vocal artists, but classical artists and painters and everything into the US environment. See, the challenge you have is when you look at India, art is still exclusive to the rich, not to the common person. You go to the museums, they are all owned by the government itself. You don't have very many private museums itself. So we have to create that environment of getting access and then moving those stuff back to US. I think US has the monetary capability and a platform to export a lot of his culture to India through his movie, through his music, or through his books itself. I think India has to look at how it can take its rich culture and bring it to the US. And I think that's where we need to work together.
There are more questions coming in. I'll filter the questions some questions you answered. There's Ajay Mutreja asking, how can Indian startups work with American companies for co-creation if disruptive technology solutions can be created for the basic needs of the Southern Hemisphere, which is Africa, Asia, South America? Naveen Bhatia is asking, US has delisted Chinese company. What should we do to attract US companies? So you've already answered. Then Ajay Mutreja, the follow-up question, he's asking, what are collaboration or possibilities in agriculture sectors, including API between India and US?
Well, let me first answer on the listing aspect. You have to understand, India decided that it will scrutinize investment coming from its border countries. And let's be very blunt about it, it's focused more towards China. You don't want China buying its assets in India at low price at this stage, which is the right thing to do. US has also, if you look at last 10 years, over 160 Chinese companies went IPO and basically capturing over $1 trillion in market cap back into China itself. And we have a policy where we don't allow Indian startups to list on a US market right away. And I think that's where we need to bring that reform through SEBI to make sure, and I think that process has started. So Indian companies get access to US capital right away, because it's not the issue of ideas India has. The challenge India has access to capital, cheap capital. And I think that's where we need to start looking from that perspective. On the API side, while India does export a large number of generics to US, my understanding is almost 90% of the API India gets is from China. So I think we have to look at, in partnership with the US, how do you create an ecosystem between the two countries to make sure the API are self-sufficient between the two nations itself. And I think India can play a very strong role. You have world-class companies, pharma companies, generic pharma companies in India, which can play a very pivotal role. So to answer your question, we have a lot of opportunities, both from a capital acquisition perspective to creating local pharma API environment between two countries itself.
Great. Now, also you talk about, I'm going to ask you about culture. Now, one of the conversations I'm, hearing from university vice chancellors, educationers is that Indian students that would go to the US, possibly their parents, and the students will look at finding opportunities locally. That means that the talent that gets nurtured in the US and flowers or blossoms in the US will not blossom. I mean, there are economic impact of that. But tell us, if that happens, if at all that happens, what is the negative impact it will have?
So I think, we have been encouraging the US government that we have approximately 200,000 plus Indian students pre-COVID in the US education system. 70% are in the STEM program, and they contribute roughly $9 billion into the local economy itself. And US also has today over 1 million shortage of software engineers, and definitely a large shortage on STEM graduate also. We have been encouraging to make sure that the optional training program is given to these students. Give them immediately, right away, if they're PhD in scientific area, a green card itself. That discussion we have proposed to the White House, on the Congress itself. That process continues. So I think, yes, it is a loss of talent to the India when these students stay here. But a lot of them go back and bring in the good ideas, governance, transparency back into the Indian environment also. So
that's
it is
a loss to both. I didn't say the loss to American economy. I mean, a lot of our bright people go there, they learn skills, they kind of implement, they become the ambassadors of the relationship. You're a good example, So it has its own multiplier impact on both the countries. We can't be myopic about it, in a very narrow sense.
It's a win-win value proposition. And I think we need to encourage that, making sure that the investment Indian students and their parents make in this education they get the right ROI, so they get a chance to work and recover from those investments. So we are encouraging the administration to relook at that in a much more broader fashion.
Thank you so much. There are more questions. There is Engineer KK Roy Chaudhary. He said, are the US companies leaving their China operations and they're still not getting anchored in India? They're not preferring India. Why? I think he's answered that, but you can briefly answer that again.
Yeah, so, we did an analysis last 6 months. 56 companies left. When I say left, means they're looking at a China plus one strategy itself. Out of 56, almost 80% prefer to be in Vietnam. And then the rest came to Cambodia and Bangladesh, and only 3 came to India itself. And I think when we look at the analysis, again, the issue is a sense of predictability. Issue is reforms itself. But what's fascinating also, and this is one point I want to leave with the audience here, is Vietnam and India has a FTA. So what happens is when they manufacture anything in Vietnam and is exported to India, is duty-free. So they tend to prefer going to Vietnam. And if they want to export anything to US also, it gets less duty rather than when they manufacture something in India and export it to the US itself, then there's a larger, higher duty also to those goods imposed by the US. So I think it's important in India to start exploring a FTA with the US to basically streamline that process of movement of goods between 2 countries.
Sir, so I just wanted to ask you one question. With so many businesses pulling out of China, do you think India has the possibility of being the next China?
The answer is always yes. The question is, what is the process? What is the time frame where India can raise the quality of life of a citizen, build the infrastructure itself? Let us not take for granted that if companies are leaving China, they will come automatic to India. I think we have to get away from that fallacy. I think India needs to step up, drive the reform, give the assurance, comfort level, so these companies can come in much more higher number to India. Why are they going to other geographies? Because they have taken the step, they've taken the leadership on trying to drive these reforms itself.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Sure.
Dr. Mukesh,
I will ask my last question, and then if Abhinav or there's another audience question we want to take, we can. My last question is, if you have to make a prediction about the future, the next 6 to 12 months, I'm not even asking 36, 16 months, 3 years, 5 years, next 6 to 12 months about the Indian economy, what would that be? Because you worked in India, you worked in Singapore, you're the chairman of a US-India forum, and so you understand business, you understand how countries are thinking, governments are thinking, entrepreneurs are thinking. So make 2 or 3 predictions for the future.
Well, I think one is you have to understand the recovery of India is not going to be either V-shape or U-shape. That's one very clear. I think it will be more like a Nike swoosh, and 2021 will be the year of recovery, depending on how we bring the stimulus into the market. We have to, at the moment, you have to understand India's economy has been shut down during the lockdown for 50 plus days itself. And for every 30 days when the economy is not functioning, it contracts almost 8%. And so you have to revive the demand. You have to revive the supply. That is going to require a lot of capital. Yes, the government has put a stimulus package. Will it have to come back again? The answer is yes. We've seen this in the US, we've seen in other geography. So there'll be multiple waves of the stimulus coming in to make sure that the supply and demand starts picking up. And that is going to take at least minimum 24 months before things really start picking up. Will India reach to its potential of 7-8%? The answer is yes, because there's enough pent-up demand out there. There's enough, I would say, creativity out there that you will see that thing picking up, but it won't be year 21, it'll be year 2022 itself. So I think we just have to be patient, we have to be consistent, we have to be focused, and making sure that, and discipline, because you don't want COVID disrupting this again. And that's the big concern we have while you're trying to take this step. And as you start opening the economy, will the COVID scenario again bring the lockdown, or will it move away itself? That's a question which we need to answer as we move forward.
Fantastic. I said it's last, but I will ask one. Do you think the Prime Minister's dream and every Indian dream of that 5 trillion economy possible? And if yes, by when do you think, provided the government does the things you talked of and more, when do you think we'll get to that 5 trillion economy milestone?
Well, you know, the answer, India being a 5 trillion economy or $10 trillion economy, the answer is yes. The question is, what is the timeline it will take? It all depends on how fast we get the engine revving up in the next 24 months. That is going to require reforms. That's going to require stimulus. And third thing is going to require at least $100 billion FDI investment continuous for next 10 years to move in that direction itself.
With this pandemic and our Prime Minister saying self-reliance, will globalization still be there, or will again start becoming more siloed, countries between countries?
Well, I think what you will see is two things happening. One is the critical supply chain. Every nation will focus on self-sufficiency in that area. It could be like India did in the 60s on the food side. Now the current scenario challenges India to make sure on the healthcare side is self-sufficient. It's not, APIs are not dependent on importing it for the vaccines, etc. US is going to do the same thing itself. But I think overall, Prime Minister campaign of be vocal about local does not mean that you become isolationist. Because the moment you start closing down the border, you have to understand India's economy is services economy. 60%,
which is two-thirds of the economy.
Yeah, and so what really happens is India cannot basically become an island itself from an economic perspective. If its economy has to realize that $10 trillion dream, it has to leverage the export itself. So I don't believe the Prime Minister campaign of be vocal about local is about just trying to push everything domestically. It is about making sure the critical supply chain are in India itself. It's about making sure you're supporting MSMEs in India itself, and they can partner with larger companies such as Amazon, Walmart to make a supply chain more efficient itself.
And if I may just build on what Dr. Aghi said, Mr. Narari, is that it is also about the unique strengths of clusters. At the end of the day, if you want to do that macroeconomic growth, it has to come from clusters. I mean, we produce certain things in certain parts of the country. So the cluster-based economic development has to happen. The local village level economy that we've been talking for 20 years has to now kick in. I think that's what the Prime Minister means. And if we become self-reliant in that sense, then we have a chance to take a leap and dream bigger and possibly become an exporter. And take our produce and our services and our technology to the world. So just to build on what Dr. Aghi said, unfortunately we have only that much time.
Thanks, Mukesh.
We once again thank Dr. Aghi for joining this live chat, and hopefully sometime in the near future we can have you again in a face-to-face conversation, but hopefully you traveling to India and meeting us face-to-face. Look forward to that, and we wish you luck in you being an ambassador for enabler for trade between India and America, and look forward to your contributions in growing both the economies. Thank you, God bless you, and have a great day back.